If you've been watching my channel for really any amount of time now, you'll probably know that I'm a pretty big fan of the Sternritter, and by extension the Vandenreich as a faction in Bleach. In fact, I've always been a big fan, right back to the days of reviewing the weekly chapter releases. For me personally, I felt like they were, for the most part anyway, exactly the villains Bleach needed at the time, especially how they were portrayed around the first Quincy invasion. Cold, ruthless, extremely powerful, terrifying, and commanding a military force that could easily match that of the Gotei 13 itself. After the, let's just be honest with ourselves here, disaster that was the Espada, it was time for a real threat. It was time for someone who could actually put up a fight, and we needed an enemy capable of ensuring that the Thousand-Year Blood War arc lived up to its namesake. It's safe to say, though, that eventually that opinion wasn't shared by the masses. It's hard to know exactly when public perception began to turn against the Sternritter as the new villains. It's unlikely to have been around the first Quincy invasion, though even then questions were already being raised as to why some of them were being killed off without receiving any screen time whatsoever, and what that really meant for these characters, but more likely I imagine it was the second Quincy invasion that cemented their narrative failing in the minds of many. And that's not to say every Sternritter is unpopular. The group absolutely has its standouts. Asnod, Askin, Kirge, Bambietta, to name a few, are all fairly popular characters, while of course the duo of Hashwolf and Basby invoked some of Kubo's strongest writing of the entire arc. But there's no denying they are often compared unfavourably to the Espada for numerous reasons, despite ostensibly fulfilling the same role in the story, and in some ways, to a much stronger, more effective degree. So, as a fan of the Sternritter myself, in today's video I wanted to analyse what I consider to be 3 major reasons the Bleach community didn't resonate with the vast majority of Sternritter in the end, as well as take a look at whether or not the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime has managed to fix any of this. Of course, make sure to let me know your thoughts and feelings down in the comments regarding the Sternritter, and I'm particularly interested if you're an anime-only viewer. How do you feel about them as a villainous faction in Bleach? Before we get started on the video, guys, as always, if you enjoyed this one and you want to help support the channel, make sure to consider hitting subscribe down below, as it really does help me out, and I do greatly appreciate it. And if you're interested in talking about games at all, go and check out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games. I just dropped a preview of Elden Ring Night Rain based on 5 hours or so with the network test. I had a lot of fun with the game, but I do think there are some things that need tightening up, some things that need to be fixed, so go over there and have a look, maybe drop your opinion down in the comments, and leave a subscribe as well if you like. I really would appreciate it. So let's kick this thing off with what I think is probably the single biggest issue people have with the Sternritter as a faction. There's way too many of them. In fact, this issue is such a prevalent one that it bleeds into several of the other problems that we are going to talk about in a minute, and in some sense, set the Sternritter up for failure long before we even got to meet most of them. Cast your minds back 12 years ago or so. That is terrifying to think about, but I vividly remember reading chapter 494, the closing chapter part 1, for the very first time, seeing that initial spread of the Sternritter and thinking, okay, this is our new Espada. But then, in the following week, in the following chapter, almost immediately, I remember opening it, seeing Nanana, who wasn't present in the previous chapter, seeing that he was designated Sternritter U, the first time we had seen that, and thinking, there's 26 of these guys? Again, I don't fundamentally have an issue with there being 26 of them, but I do think it leads to some narrative dissonance. How do we, as the reader, know who among them to really care about, who to get invested in? And of course that's Kubo's problem to solve, and this is a major issue as of the first invasion. Kubo introduces 4 Sternritter, who manage to steal the captain's bankai: Asnod, Bambietta, Kangdu, and BG9, and I think it was fairly reasonable on the reader's part to assume, as we did, that these guys might have been important villains moving forward. But of course, you all know how it turned out. Kangdu and BG9 were defeated and unceremoniously killed barely 10 chapters into the second major battle, while Bambietta was also hastily defeated and then subjected to an unprecedented fate. Let me reiterate, 3 of the 4 Sternritter who stole Bankai in the first invasion were defeated within the first 10 chapters of the second invasion. Only Asnod really retained any semblance of importance among the group, getting a fully fleshed out battle with Rukia and even facing off with her much anticipated Bankai. That battle was definitely afforded a level of prominence that the other 3 were not, but even then he was dead within the span of half a volume. And so once these Sternritter are all swiftly defeated, what are you left with? They were the major faces from the first invasion, the enemies that we originally got attached to, and well, they're now all gone, just like that. There are other Sternritter from the first invasion remaining, of course, Robert and Nanana, for example, but it was clear early on that Kubo didn't have any plans for them, or just flat out forgot them, while Masked Emasculine manages to make a splash, but again is killed off at the end of his first real battle. Kubo instead shifted focus to characters he clearly decided between invasions that he'd rather utilise. The Bambis, of course, but also the Schutzstoffel, who themselves are really introduced too late to be truly effective, with the rest of the Sternritter needing to be cleaned up beforehand, but still they do make much more of an impact. Would things have been better if we halved the number of Sternritter and gave them all treatment similar to that of the Schutzstoffel instead? Again, there are, and there always are, exceptions here. Hashwolf and Basby stand tall above the rest as obviously good, very well written characters, and the same is true of Askin as well, though he doesn't receive as much depth. But the issue with there being so many Sternritter, even with 5 of them being killed off in the first invasion, is that it became apparent that we simply weren't going to get to spend much time with any of these guys individually. Characters like Nyanzol Wyzol are introduced only to then be killed off 3 chapters later, and even the decidedly more popular Gremmy exists in a complete narrative vacuum, introduced and killed in his battle with Kenpachi, which all exists in volume 64. And this happened quite a lot throughout the second invasion specifically. Sternritter were essentially lined up and knocked down in the space of a few volumes at a time, and while you would expect this of the villains, the sheer number of them and frequency of their defeats slowly began to ring hollow. The death of each Espada, without exception except for maybe one exception, I said there was always an exception, was a major event. I can remember them all vividly. It's only really Yami whose death is, I would say, a bit of a non-event, but then that's pretty in character. But the deaths of the Sternritter began to lose all impact after a while as they were dealt with so swiftly and without a lot of fanfare. There's just something about them, about their portrayal, about the feel, about the level of gravitas and prominence lent to each of them. Only some of the Sternritter have what I would call Espada level defeats. Asnod again is another one whose death I think is on the level of an Espada's death. It feels like it has that same amount of prominence. And this leads into another issue that comes about as a result of there being so many of them. None of this would matter so much if they weren't Sternritter. Allow me to clarify. The title and rank of Sternritter brings with it a certain level of gravitas and expectation. Characters like Kirge Opie and Asnod again from the first battle got us excited to see them all in action, but many of these characters that came after exhibited strength barely befitting a Sternritter at all as we supposedly knew them. And that's because Sternritter is just a catch-all term for a group of characters who have a vast gulf in strength between them, kind of like calling a character captain level, which these guys all supposedly are. While the difference in strength between the first Espada and the ninth Espada is obvious and palpable, as it should be, the difference in strength between, say, Candice and Gerard, who are technically part of the same rank, even though Gerard is a Schutzstoffel, is completely unfathomable. This is one area where it feels like Kubo might have been better served had he invented a lower rank akin to Fraction, and then had a number of these less important Sternritter fulfill that role instead. No one complained when Barragan's Fraction were all taken out within a chapter of each other, but the name Sternritter carried a much heavier weight. Imagine, for example, if Robert, Nanana, and Candice were a lower ranked officer. Them being one-shotted off-screen by Byakuya may not have stung quite so much in that regard. It's all about perception. And then there's the simple fact that this is just an unmanageable number of characters for any author to really utilise effectively. There's a reason so many Sternritter didn't really receive a single fight, despite there being more than enough of them to do so, to accommodate that. Characters like Yamamoto, Kenpachi, and Byakuya killing multiple Sternritter at once throws off the balance big time and leaves many characters out in the cold. Again, revisiting my anecdote from earlier, when I first saw that the Sternritter were being ordered or ranked or whatever it was I thought back in the day by the alphabet, my other immediate thought was, okay, we've got 26 of these guys, Kubo is doing that on purpose so that we have enough potentially here to fight every captain and even every vice captain, and of course that absolutely did not happen. And speaking of Nanana, Nanana is absolutely, I would say, one of the most famous examples of Sternritter mismanagement, at least in my opinion. He's given a relatively decent amount of screen time, but does absolutely nothing with it. His battle with Rose is off-screen, then he's incinerated by Yamamoto. After this, he spies on Renji, setting up a potential battle between the two of them, but in the manga it leads absolutely nowhere, and was completely cut from the anime, and then is off-screened by Byakuya after a pretty pathetic attempt at stopping Ichigo. Even Sternritter who were given some successful build-up, like Pepe, don't manage to last any longer than the requisite 3 chapters or so before being killed off immediately, because contrary to popular belief, the pacing in the Thousand Year Blood War arc is actually extremely fast, and that does come at the detriment of many of these villains. I don't want to belabor the point much longer, but as you can see, the sheer number of villains did have a knock-on effect, and in more ways than one. The absolute gulf in quality between how characters like Kirige and, say, Meninas are portrayed is absurd. As a result of there being so many of them, a lot of the Sternritter lost out on getting decent fights, or even exciting transformations. Again, every single Espada Resurrection, this time without exception, was a massive deal. Hell, every Arrancar Resurrection was a massive deal for the most part, but the same can't be said of the Sternritter and their Volstendish, many of which feel completely inconsistent and above all else, diluted. Again, if there had only been a few Sternritter, maybe again 10 or so, 13 if you really want to make it a bigger, more opposing and intimidating force than the Espada by sheer numbers alone, again, if there had only been a few of them and then some lower ranking soldiers to flesh out the named ranks, it wouldn't have mattered so much if those lower ranked soldiers just sprouted basic wings in unison like we see here, but these are supposed to be the big transformations for the arc's major enemies. Again, it all comes down to perception, I can't reiterate that enough. Imagine if Kangdu was Basby's Fraction, or his Quincy equivalent. Kangdu then being defeated in the way he is by Hitsugaya really wouldn't have stung so badly. And it also wouldn't have been quite so grating that we never got to see his Quincy Volstendish. Speaking of the Quincy Volstendish, let's move on to our next point, and that's their weird powers. One of the biggest, most recurring complaints I used to see about the Sternritter was that they didn't feel like Quincy. So much so that a long time ago now, I made a video specifically highlighting the instances where they each used bows to try and reinforce that many of them did in fact showcase Quincy traits. And it's true, the Shrifts as a concept don't really have anything to do with the Quincy as we had known them throughout the entire story to date. But that's also because Yuha himself was only introduced in the final arc, completely upending what it meant to be a Quincy. And again, where Shrifts are concerned, they don't bother me, although I do think they are often a little too abstract and weird. The very best shrifts, the most memorable shrifts, are those that present themselves in a much more straightforward manner, like Basby's the Heat or Asnod's the Fear, for example. Askin's the Death Dealing is another one that feels like the poster child for why these shrifts felt way too convoluted, too weird, and too abstract, and it absolutely is. And it's noticeably better when it is more streamlined later on, when it really comes down to Askin uses poison-based abilities and can achieve immunity if you fail to kill him. The issue isn't so much with the shrifts themselves, but with many of the Sternritter solely relying on them above all else, and in turn being utterly defined by them, which is something we'll go into more detail on in our third and final point, as it ties in. It makes sense, of course, for the Sternritter to want to use their shrifts in battle. After all, they've been chosen by God, essentially to wield a portion of his power in a manner that speaks to them and their personality and what their soul craves. But at the same time, the Shrift do end up completely dominating the majority of their fights. And I think, yeah, there's a very real instance of the Sternritter as Quincy losing their identity when so much of their battles is just taken over by these frankly abstract and unconnected powers. Again, Kyrige OP is often looked to by the community as an example of the ideal Sternritter in many respects, and it's no coincidence that he almost exclusively uses traditional Quincy techniques in his battle. In the manga, Kyrige was the only Sternritter to use Sclavorai, a Quincy's ability to dominate Reishi, perhaps the very foundation of what actually makes a Quincy in the first place, and to this day remains the only Sternritter in both the manga and the anime to have used Ranso Tengai, a Quincy's ability to hold their broken body together using Reishi strings, effectively turning themselves into a puppet to continue fighting. Kyrige only used his shrift, the Jail, when he absolutely had no other choice. Ichigo was escaping, and if he made it to the Soul Society too early, Kyrige would have failed in his mission, and so he uses the Jail as a last-ditch effort to prevent Ichigo's escape. Imagine if the Shrift had all been these absolute game-changer abilities that were only used in the most dire of circumstances to completely turn the tide or swing the pendulum when the hour drew desperate. That being said, as I pointed out earlier, many of the Sternritter do still use bows or some equivalent, but I think what's missing here for a lot of people is that scrappy resourcefulness shown by someone like Uryu, that reliance on tools and equipment, the likes of Jinto for example, to fight on an even playing field. Ultimately for me, their weird powers is perhaps the least egregious point on this list because it makes total sense from a narrative perspective that this is how the Quincy would fight. After all, they lost the war 1,000 years ago, and so unlike the Shinigami who grew complacent in their victory, have spent that millennium growing stronger, and even turning to occult methods to increase their own power, leaving behind their pride as a Quincy as a result. That's pretty cool to me, but at the same time I get it when a Sternritter is only around for a few chapters, and literally all they use is their various nebulous shrift power. Even after the 1,000-Year Blood War arc redefining what it means to be a Quincy, it doesn't feel inherently like how a Quincy should fight. And again, it probably doesn't help that the first Sternritter we saw fighting was such a shining example of that traditional Quincy too. But you know, it's not to say that there aren't examples of the Sternritters still being resourceful. The bankai stealing medallions are a great example of them realizing they don't really have any counter for the Shinigami's bankai and so turn to other methods instead. And so we come to the third and final issue that I think people had, or have, with the Sternritter, and that's a lack of depth for these characters across the board. And it's true, the vast majority of these 26 or so villains received virtually no depth or even really characterization whatsoever. At least half of them are nothing more than two-dimensional bad guys whose only real personality trait is worshipping Yhwach as a god king, while also only being defined by their shrift and nothing more. Let's take Asnod, one of the most popular Sternritter of the bunch, and as I said earlier, someone that I think is actually a good character. And while I think that Asnod is a great character even, there's no denying his characterization is completely defined by his shrift, the fear. It's why he looks the way he does, it's why he fights the way he does, and it's pretty much all he talks about. Asnod only appears in, I think, about 14 chapters of this arc, and virtually all of his dialogue is relegated to fear and its effects. And again, you might be thinking, well, that makes total sense. After having received a portion of Yhwach's power, Asnod effectively is an extension of his king, and this is what makes him who he is. And I totally get that, and I totally agree. But as someone who would like to maybe know more about these characters on an individual level, we really don't get that. And in fact, where Asnod is concerned, we do actually get more than the average Quincy. We see him prior to receiving his shrift, which is a total rarity. The same is true of characters like Pepe, or Driscoll, or Nyanzol, or Gremmy. These characters are completely defined by their shrift, and that's really about it. Again, as always, there are exceptions to be found here. Basby, for example, is an actual fleshed out character, with interesting fights, motivations, and yes, even an arc. And while his design and personality are absolutely informed by his shrift, it doesn't dominate who he is and how he presents himself on the page. This is true also for characters like Askin, Lil Toto, and of course, Hashwolf. There are a few Sternritter then with real depth to them, but the absolute majority have basically nothing going on beneath a surface level appeal, and I'm guilty of this as well. Kang-Do is one of my favourite Sternritter, but it's really only because I think he has an awesome design. In terms of depth, I mean, what really is there? He inexplicably believes that those who live together should also die together. Why, we have absolutely no idea, and he refuses to accept death at Hashwolf's hand, but he will die if Yhwach demands it, which is pretty cool. But, I mean, that's really it. I guess because his shrift is the iron, that means he's also stoic at the same time? That's the kind of level that a lot of the Sternritter are at in terms of their characterization. And I get it. I think Kubo went into the final arc wanting an enemy who couldn't be sympathised with easily, and let's face it, their real-world comparison speaks for itself. A lot of the Sternritter are supposed to be evil for evil's sake, I think. Again, the likes of Kirge, Driscoll, Pepe, and Giselle come to mind. We can't relate to a lot of these characters, and many of them end up feeling like the monster of the week in how despicable they are and how quickly they're killed off. This translates to their fights too. More Sternritter are killed by other Quincy than they are by Shinigami, which is completely ludicrous, and again makes it hard to truly understand them as a military faction. It's clear that there is a nebulous glory that they are all chasing, while others like Robert are simply hoping to avoid annihilation, but there needs to be a little more than that. It doesn't help that the vast majority of Sternritter don't receive any kind of flashback whatsoever to tell us who they really are, or what they want, or even what they've been through and what experiences they've had in life. Even for a character like Asnod, who, like I said earlier, I think is defined by his shrift, him just receiving a few pages of backstory where we find out that he was bedridden in a hospital on his deathbed, and in the manga we see that he was a religious man as well, who was terrified of going to hell when he died. Even just that adds so much to his character. Again, I think it makes sense though. The reality is that a lot of the Sternritter probably haven't really been through anything, and perhaps don't desire anything. Many of them are just zealots who were bestowed power and will now die for their king, and that's fine. But I think we needed just a little more from one or two others that Kubo designated as the standouts. Obviously, Hashwolf and Basby's story is amazing, and like I said, Asnod kind of inexplicably receives a flashback, but what about the Bambis? They're very popular, they get quite a lot of screen time, but we ultimately don't know anything about them. How do they know each other? What about someone like Askin? Again, very, very popular, gets an awful lot of screen time, kind of felt like he was a shoo-in for a flashback and doesn't get anything of the sort. His motivation is totally different from the rest of the Sternritter, and that helps him to stand out. What about the other Schutzstaffel members? Gerard and Leal, for example, should have been, again, shoo-ins for backstories, but again, where characters like Leal are concerned, it feels like Kubo actively does not want you to know him beyond the fact he is this merciless executioner of God, perhaps to add to the terror we feel when we see him in battle, especially once he transforms. He is supposed to be this unrelatable, otherworldly, angelic being. That being said, on the flip side of this, I often think there is a rose-tinted glasses approach to this element of the Espada as well. The Espada was made up of far fewer members, and even then, most of them had very little real depth to actually speak of. Yami, Aranero, Zamari, Harabel, all of these characters are pretty two-dimensional in the manga for the most part. Hell, even Ulquiorra doesn't receive a flashback in the manga itself. Aranero feels like the BG9 of the Espada quite literally, in that he openly looks really weird and unique, but Kubo doesn't explain it at all, and barely even alludes to it outside of a single sentence for each of them. Aranero says to Rukia, for example, "If you have something to say about our faces, keep it to yourself, we've heard it all before." Meanwhile, in BG9's case, after he's hit by Soifon's Shunko, she wonders how he could still be breathing, to which he replies, "I was never breathing to begin with." And then Soifon follows that up by clarifying that he's a mechanical doll, and then nothing is ever mentioned about it ever again. But that's pretty much it for what I think are the three major reasons why people did not like the Sternritter back in the day, and yes, even went so far as to hating them, I think. As a genuine fan of the faction, even I'm aware of many of the issues plaguing this group of villainous Quincy, but there's one last question I want to pose before we end this video. Has the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime fixed any of this? And honestly, it's tough to say. Bringing these characters to life through animation and voice acting will always help them to some degree, and it's been really cool seeing the new details added in the anime, such as the unifying church bell motif between the Sternritter Volstendish, for example, which helps them to feel more cohesive as a unit. Not only that, but the anime has made a concerted effort to unify their power sets too, with multiple Sternritter now using Quincy techniques like Sclaverai over the course of the war, which was really cool to see. On the other hand, I think the anime may have actually exacerbated some of the issues found in the manga, principally the amount of time we actually get to spend with some of these characters. Gremmy is an example I always love to go back to. Sure, he now gets a couple of fleeting new appearances earlier on in the anime, which is nice, but his entire fight with Kenpachi is now over within a single episode, as opposed to a single volume of 10 chapters, after which he is gone from the anime forever. The same goes for someone like Asnot. Again, Asnot was built up to be a terrifying villain in the first invasion, and we waited with bated breath for his inevitable final showdown in the manga. At least there, while not particularly long, his fight with Rukia was drawn out over the course of a month or so. Here in the anime, once again he is killed within the span of a single week, snuffed out just like that, never again to reappear. In some ways, Asnot kinda gets it a little worse than the others who stole bankai here in the anime. At the very least, Kangdu and BG9's execution scene is considerably more drawn out here in the anime than it was in the manga. The same is again true for the likes of Pepe, or even worse, someone like Nyanzol, who is literally introduced and killed within the space of 2 minutes in the anime. The entire character gets 2 minutes of screen time. That's not really the anime's fault, of course, but again, with the manga we were at least able to sit with this character and speculate for a couple of weeks before he eventually died. It is an unfortunate side effect, I think. Not only that, but the anime hasn't seen fit to add any additional depth to these characters in regards to their personalities, no new flashbacks, and the anime even removed some small details like what the Bambis would ask for from Yuhabak should they succeed in killing Ichigo. That gave us at least some insight into who they really were. But on the flip side, the anime has added more depth to these characters in regards to their battles. Again, characters like Lil Toto, Maninas, and Giselle were given an entirely new fight here in the anime, allowing them to showcase fully fleshed out Volstendish as opposed to the manga. The same is true, to a lesser extent, of Robert, Nanana, and Candice, who were also given slightly more to do here. But again, on the flip side, Robert's death scene is removed. The one scene that actually explained why he was doing any of this to begin with. On the whole, as an outsider looking in, as someone who does love the Sternritter in general, I'd have to say that no, I don't think the anime has fixed the inherent issues with the Sternritter as a faction, because, at least from what I can see, they aren't fixable, at least not easily. These issues, particularly the sheer number of them and their lack of depth, really do kind of snowball into one. That said, I also think it's commendable that a few of these characters did indeed rise to the top to become fan favourites. Askin is my third favourite character in the entire series. But I can't help but feel like many of these problems are what hold the Sternritter back from ever attaining the same status among the community as the Espada. Or maybe it's none of this, and it's just a very simple case of we've seen this all before. The Sternritter were never going to enjoy the same reception as the Espada, because Bleach has already had its villainous organization once before, and it just so happened to be one of the most popular of all time. So that's some pretty unfortunately big shoes for the Sternritter to fill. At the very least, the Sternritter did absolutely get one thing right in comparison to the Espada: they were a genuine threat. Alright guys, but that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope as always you took some value away from it as well. I'd love to know what you think down in the comments below. How do you feel about the Sternritter as a faction in general, the individual characters involved? What do you think about the 3 points that I put across, the 3 main points here as to why I think the community reacted negatively to these characters way back in the day? Their overall depth, the sheer number of them, and their weird, un-Quincy-like abilities. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. And again, I'm especially interested if you are an anime-only viewer. That's a perspective I would love to hear, I would love to get. So do let me know down in the comments below, as an anime-only viewer of Bleach, how have you found the Sternritter to be in the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime? And if you were someone who was reading Bleach weekly 10, 12 years ago alongside me, I'd love to know as well what you thought of the Sternritter back in the day, and if you saw the same response to the Sternritter that I did week in and week out. I'd love to know all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Thanks so much again for watching, guys. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. It really does help the channel out, and I really do appreciate it. And go and check out Mr. Tomo Talks Games. Check out my most recent video on Elden Ring Night Rain. I'd love to get your opinions over there as well. And maybe hit subscribe too. Again, the channel does need your support, and it is greatly appreciated. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.